Good morning, everybody. Welcome to EDF 2020 annual results. So before leaving the floor to our Group Chairman and CEO Jean-Bernard Lévy and our Group CFO Xavier Gier, we would like to show you a very short video on the highlights of our group in 2020. Hope you'll enjoy it, and I hope you'll enjoy our results later. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the presentation of our group's results for year 2020. All of us, naturally, would like to meet in the usual conditions. As you well know, the spread of the epidemic demands the greatest caution. So we have chosen very simply to communicate remotely, and in spite of the circumstances, I know many of you will join our discussion, and you have my heartfelt thanks. As was the case for all businesses and for each and every one of us, 2020 was very challenging. Faced with this trying period, EDF exhibited unfailing resilience and adaptability. Committed to the values of public service, EDF's strong workforce, 165,000 people, we all stepped up to the plate, and I want to thank all of them sincerely. Through the public health crisis, we continue to generate and distribute the electricity so essential to France and the countries where we operate, while keeping our employees safe and healthy. We quickly readjusted, and no one of our clients was deprived of electricity. We stood alongside all our customers, including private homes, businesses, communities, and public services, in particular hospitals, and we delivered the highest standards of service. In response to a larger number of payment issues than usual, we also found personalized solutions for our customers. At all levels of our organizations, our employees rallied around solidarity initiatives, such as the donation of protective equipment or the setting up of an emergency solidarity fund in order to help healthcare personnel and the lowest income populations. In order to relieve the cash position of many of our suppliers weakened by the crisis, more especially SMEs, we set up an accelerated payment procedure. Our group's resilience is also reflected in our financial results. Our EBITDA is solid, amounting to 16.2 billion euros. The impact of the crisis, we can say it had a moderate impact. The impact of the crisis is under control, amounting to 1.5 billion euros, less than 10% of the EBITDA. This demonstrates the robustness of our group's fundamentals. And Xavier will come back to this point later. We succeeded in making a profit. Our net income, excluding non-recurring items, is largely positive, amounting to roughly 2 billion euros. And net income group share also remains positive. Net financial debt to EBITDA ratio is 2.6 times. It decreased slightly compared to 2019. This figure is obviously on target with the guidance well below 3 times. We are therefore able to maintain EDF's financial robustness even in these troubled times. At the annual meeting, which we held on the 17th of February, the Board of Directors decided to recommend a dividend amounting to 21 cents of a euro per share for financial year 2020, corresponding to 45% payout ratio, the payout of net income excluding non-recurring items. The French state already committed to opt for a scrip dividend payment. The public health crisis should not overshadow the climate change emergency. The reduction of carbon emissions throughout the world is central to our strategy. The post-COVID recovery will rely on the building of a low-carbon world. This is now the common thread of French and European stimulus strategies, and the USA just rejoined the Paris Accord. A carbon-neutral world is the keystone of EDF's raison d'être, adopted at the General Meeting of Shareholders in May. The raison d'être is to build a net-zero energy future with electricity and innovative solutions and services, to help save the planet and drive well-being and economic development. The raison d'être has prompted us to raise some of the strategic targets that we had set out in CAP 2030. In the area of energy services, we are seeking to help our customers achieve carbon neutrality with the objective of reducing their carbon emissions by 15 million tons in France by 2030. This ambition will be achieved through the development of innovative services across the group, both in France and abroad, which are expected to bring in sales to the level of 10 billion euros by 2030. Regarding the generation of decarbonized electricity, we are raising our net installed renewable capacity target, from 50 to 60 gigawatts, almost double, even slightly above double, the amount in 2015. With the argument of decarbonization, we are raising the profile of France's nuclear industry on the international market. We intend to start new EPR projects and prepare for the sale of France's small modular reactors. On a global scale, we have set a hydro capacity target, 1.5 to 2 gigawatts of net new capacity in hydro around the world by 2030. We'll also be leveraging on our position as a leader on the off-grid market in Africa, and we aim to have sold 1 million solar kits by 2030, and hence providing around 5 million people with access to electricity. The achievement of carbon neutrality requires the preservation of natural resources as well as responsible and mutually supportive, inclusive growth. Advocated by our raison d'être, this is central to our policy of societal and environmental responsibility. 2020 will obviously have been an exceptional year for our environmental commitments. While EDF already emits 5 times less carbon per kilowatt hour generated than the European average, we are continuing to reduce our carbon intensity, which are our direct emissions in proportion to the electricity output. We are now aiming for 35 grams per kilowatt hour generated by 2030. Obviously, this will be among the best performance throughout the industry. In 2020, we undertook to completely phase out the use of coal in all parts of the world where we operate by 2030. We have also raised our target for the reduction of direct carbon emissions from 40 to 50%, and for the first time ever, we have also decided to reduce our indirect carbon emissions with challenging targets, minus 8% by 2030 and minus 28% by 2030. This is because the achievement of carbon neutrality requires us to reduce all carbon emissions across scopes 1 and 2 and 3. We are, we believe, one of the few players to set ourselves such an ambitious goal. I'm particularly proud of the fact that our carbon reduction targets have obtained the prestigious and demanding Science Based Targets Initiative certification. This commendation bears testimony to the fact that our targets align with the curtailment of global warming to, as they say, well below 2 degrees. Well below 2 degrees. On a societal level, maybe I can highlight 2 advancements. First, the number of women sitting on the group's management committees is constantly increasing. In 2020, it was well above the CAC 40 average and has already exceeded the level we were aiming to reach in the next 3 years, which we have now 29% of women sitting on the group's management committees. So we have now to revise our 2023 target upwards, and this is in progress. We are proud also to be France's leading hirer of apprentices. 1 apprentice in 100 in France works for EDF. We are adding a new target whereby 1 apprentice in 3 will come from priority districts and revitalized rural areas. I would now like to highlight some noteworthy facts of the past year. Our achievements are numerous. The renewable sector is growing faster from year to year. 2020 saw significant progress in capacities under construction and in capacities already commissioned, respectively by plus 56% and plus 32%. This shows our ability to keep tight control over our projects. Whether prospective, whether under development or secured, our pipeline of projects is very well stocked, 60 gigawatt, already a sign of further growth in the years to come. 2020 was an important year for offshore wind power with the start of construction on the Fécamp wind farm close to the northern coast of France. And we also acquired projects amounting to 1 gigawatt close to Ireland. As for on-land wind capacity, we have started building the biggest project of this type in the Middle East. It is called Dumat. It is in Saudi Arabia. We also commissioned close to 1.5 gigawatt of capacity, primarily in the United States. In the solar sector, I am pleased with the fact that for the Al Dhafra solar projects in the United Arab Emirates, the biggest in the world with a capacity of 2 gigawatts. EDF has been awarded this project in a consortium with other players. In India, we have strengthened our position, 1.3 gigawatt of new solar projects, not to mention our long-standing market, our number one market, the United States, where last year we acquired an additional 4.5 gigawatt worth of solar projects, 4.5 gigawatts. In the solar plan in France, which is a key priority, we just reached our target of 30% market share in the latest tender organized by the regulator, and we now have a portfolio of more than 3 gigawatts of projects under development, secured or under construction. We are also the clear number one on the rooftop solar market in our home country. In the hydro sector, I take great pride in the completion of Romanche-Gavet. Maybe some of you saw it on the movie a few minutes ago. It is now completed, the biggest hydro project in France. It will now deliver 40% more generation capacity than the previous facility, and it showcases our expertise when it comes to landscaping our structures to blend in with their surroundings, as well as protecting biodiversity. In Cameroon, the Nachtigal Dam project is moving towards its commissioning date in 2024. One-third of the civil works are completed. The rollout of our storage plant, Plan Stockage, looks promising. Approximately 1 gigawatt of projects have already been completed or secured. In 2020, we were awarded projects in the USA and in Israel, among others. We also launched the construction of battery storage facilities with a capacity of 100 megawatt in the United Kingdom, and we commissioned a hybrid Toucan plant in French Guiana. When it comes to nuclear, the other cornerstone of decarbonized electricity generation, I would first like to highlight the extraordinary resilience of France's nuclear fleet. Thanks to the quick and remarkable adaptation of our maintenance programs, the required amount of power was generated throughout the sanitary crisis and throughout the winter. Our workforce quickly adjusted to new working conditions, and the Grand Carénage program cleared very important milestones, including very recently the completion of the fourth 10-year outage at Bugey 2. This is the second in the 900 megawatt reactor series. On the Flamanville 3 site, our workforce is preparing for repair work on penetration wells. In the United Kingdom, all key milestones of the Hinkley Point 3 projects were achieved while complying strictly with the new health precautions. This is illustrated by the installation of the common raft on reactor number 2, followed by the installation of the first containment ring on reactor number 1. I'm extremely pleased by the start of the discussions with the UK government on the funding of 2 new PR units in Sizewell C. This initiative highlights the importance that the UK attaches to nuclear as part of its climate change goals. In order to successfully meet the challenges of nuclear in France and in the export markets, in 2019, we launched the Plan Excel. The Excel plan seeks to restore the industrial excellence, which used to be the hallmark of France's nuclear industry. We have embarked on the second phase of this plan, which revolves around 21 new commitments for mid-21. In the area of customers and services, I'm pleased to note that the energy we have poured into winning market share is bearing fruit. Nearly 1 million residential customers have chosen one of our market-based offerings for the supply of electricity. This is due to the quality of our customer service, and our range of offerings is constantly expanding. We have now become also a major player on the heat pump market with our new Easy by EDF platform. Sales increased by a factor of 5 from the first to the second half of the year. We are consolidating our positions on the resident market in Belgium through EDF Luminous, which is planning to acquire a portfolio of 360,000 customers, and also in the UK with the takeover of a portfolio consisting of Green Networks Energy's customers, also in the range of 350,000. Dahlia is a brilliant example of our know-how in the area of energy efficiency and is reporting new wins, some of them in the sector of renewable heating networks. With regard to electric mobility, we changed scale in 2020. EDF Group now has more than 100,000 charging stations in Europe. In France, our subsidiary Easivia has become a leader in the public charging sector, number one on that sector, with 26% market share. In the promising sector of decarbonized hydrogen, we've seen in 2020 the merits of our strategy with the first success of our subsidiary called Hynamics. In Auxerre, Hynamics will be building a hydrogen production and distribution facility for public transport operators. In Germany, Hynamics will be building one of the most powerful electrolyzer networks in Europe, 30 megawatt, for industrial purposes, and this will be powered by an offshore wind farm. A few words about Enedis. Rollout of the Linky smart meter is nearing completion. Almost 30 million meters were installed by the end of 2020, meaning that we are almost 1 year ahead in the rollout schedule. In spite of the sanitary crisis, the connection of our customers went ahead at a sustained pace and maintenance continued to be performed on the distribution network. So all praise also to the Enedis employees for succeeding in their public service commitments. In 2020, Enedis was once again a major contributor to the penetration of electric mobility across our regions and to the integration of more and more renewables into the grid. A clear illustration of Enedis' central role in the energy transition is Enedis' human industrial project for the period of 2020 to 2025, which was launched in the middle of 2020. So this ends the first part of my presentation. I will now hand over to Xavier Gir, our Chief Financial Officer, and Xavier will walk you through our results in more detail. Please, Xavier.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you this morning, and I will now present you our 2020 financial results in more detail. Looking at the key figures, sales amounted to circa 69 billion euros, a 3.4% organic decrease versus 2019. EBITDA came to circa 16.2 billion euros, down 2.7% in organic terms. Net recurring income stood at circa 2 billion euros. Net income group share amounted to circa 0.7 billion euros. I will come back to these specific items later on in the presentation. Net financial debt raised by about 1.2 billion euros to 42.3 billion euros. And finally, net financial debt to EBITDA ratio stood at 2.61 times at end of 2020. Let's now focus on the COVID impact. At EBITDA level, the COVID impact came out at circa 1.5 billion euros. This can be split as follows. First, nuclear activity in France was impacted by 0.7 billion euros. This was mostly a consequence of an extensive modulation to adapt production to the drop in power consumption and of extended outages caused by sanitary restrictions on sites. H1 and H2 ended up almost equally impacted. Second, customers and services were impacted by 0.6 billion euros. This was linked to a drop in power consumption, a slowdown in projects and services deployment in support of the customers, and an increase in customers' credit risk. H1 was impacted by 0.5 billion euros as the peak of the lockdown did materialize, whereas H2 was only marginally impacted by 0.1 billion euros. Last, regulated activities were impacted almost exclusively in H1 by 0.2 billion euros as a consequence of lower distributed volumes and less grid connection works. In a nutshell, 2/3 of the 1.5 billion euros COVID impact on EBITDA relate to H1 and only 1/3 to H2, the second semester experiencing a clear activity and performance recovery. To mitigate these impacts, we reacted quickly by setting a medium-term action plan that was announced in July 2020. This plan consists of a 0.5 billion euros OPEX reduction, excluding inflation, by 2022 compared to 2019, and of circa 3 billion euros disposals over the period 20 to 22. This plan is underway. The OPEX reduction at the end of 2020 versus 2019 amounted to 0.2 billion euros excluding inflation, and the disposals signed or closed at the end of 2020 amounted to circa 0.5 billion euros, including the signing of the Edison's Norwegian E&P assets on the 30th of December 2020. As a whole, the group's revised guidance was slightly exceeded, and adjusted from the COVID impact, group's EBITDA would have increased by more than 6% compared to 2019, in line with the initial EBITDA guidance for the year. Let me now walk you through the group's EBITDA in more details. This slide shows its evolution by segment, slide 20. As you can see, the EBITDA slightly decreased by 2.7%, mainly in the following three segments. First, France generation and supply activities impacted by lower nuclear output. Second, EDF Renewables showed a decrease of 0.3 billion euros, mostly due to the one-off positive impact of LNG offshore wind farm 50% disposal in 2019. And third, the other activities are impacted by additional provisions in the LNG business for some long-term contracts. On the opposite, the following segments recorded a positive EBITDA growth versus 2019, despite the impacts of the COVID crisis. France, regulated activities with an increase in tariffs. United Kingdom, with nuclear realized prices. Italy, with good performance in renewables and gas activities. And finally, other international, with a more favorable PPA indexation in Brazil. This slide presents another view of the variation of the EBITDA, grouping the main effects together. Two main negative impacts excluding COVID. The development and sale of structured assets activity of EDF Renewables decreased by 0.3 billion euros in 2020, as 2019 was positively impacted by the sale of 50% of the NNG Scottish offshore wind farm project. The lower generation in France and the UK, primarily due to extended outages not related to COVID, for minus 0.3 billion euros. These negative effects were counterbalanced by some positive ones, mostly expected and shared with you 1 year ago. The most impactful one was the favorable energy price effects in France, including the catch-up on tariffs, and in the UK through nuclear realized prices, as well as favorable tariff revision for Enedis. These three elements represent a total close to plus 1.7 billion euros. Nuclear output in France came to 335.4 terawatt-hours, down 44 terawatt-hours compared to 2019. Main reasons. First, the COVID impact was estimated at approximately 33 terawatt-hours. Second, the extended outages at Flamanville 1 and 2 and Paris 2 contributed to the decrease in nuclear output by an amount of circa 19 terawatt-hours. Third, the closure of the two reactors of Fessenheim, representing a loss of around 10 terawatt-hours. Finally, planning optimization performed across the fleet helped mitigate those effects by around 14 terawatt-hours. These outages rescheduling was greatly implemented to preserve security of supply during winter. French hydro output was up by 12.6%. This was made possible thanks to a high level of storage at the end of 2019 and to normal hydro conditions in 2020 versus below average in 2019. It is worth noting that the level of Lake France was up 16% at end of 2020 compared to historical level. EBITDA for France generation and supply activities was down organically by 2.7% to 7.4 billion euros. Adjusted from the COVID effect, the EBITDA would have increased by 8.8%, all other things being equal. The overall energy volume effect represents a decrease of 209 million euros. Nuclear output was down by an estimated 11 terawatt-hours due to other non-COVID factors. and hydro output was up by 5.1 terawatt-hours. The most favorable driver is the increase in energy prices, representing a positive 748 million euros due to the tariff increases in June 2019 and February 2020, the latter including half of the tariff catch-up in 2019. Overall, for downstream, the increase was estimated at 182 million euros. Two opposite and distinct effects here. On the one hand, the erosion of market share represented a decrease of 12.3 terawatt-hours. On the other hand, EBITDA benefited from higher capacity revenues driven by a price effect from June. Operating expenses were down by 148 million euros. Last, the negative impact of the sanitary crisis was estimated at circa 0.9 billion euros. This was related to a loss of 33 terawatt-hours of nuclear output, as already explained, to the decrease in electricity consumption for an estimated 8 terawatt-hours, and to an increase in the risk of bad debt for 0.1 billion euros. Regulated activities EBITDA reached 5.2 billion euros, up 2.1% in organic terms compared to 2019. Adjusted from the COVID effect, the increase would have reached close to 7%, all other things being equal. These figures confirm Enedis' business model resilience. It reflects a contrasted trend throughout the year. H1 was a negative 4.6%, while H2 showed a recovery with plus 6.6% growth compared to the same period in 2019. The change in prices had a positive effect of circa 0.4 billion euros, in line with the favorable TERP 5 indexation that took place on the 1st of August 2019 and 2020. The climate, 6.8 terawatt-hours less distributed volumes and climatic hazards, on the contrary less impacting than last year, had together an estimated unfavorable impact of circa 0.1 billion euros. The decline in distributed volumes, about 8.4 terawatt-hours excluding climate effects, and network connection services reflects the impact of the health crisis. This was estimated around 0.2 billion euros. Let me remind you that new regulated tariff TERP 6 will start on August 1st, 2021 for a period of 4 years. The remuneration of the assets that Enedis is operating remains stable at 2.5% pre-tax, whereas the remuneration of the regulated equity has been revised downward to 2.3% to reflect the decrease of the income tax rate and the drop in the risk-free rate. The catch-up mechanism was confirmed, as well as the incentive regulation. Enedis has also launched an industrial and human project for 2020 to 2025 period. To give you an accurate view on Enedis' business model, projects, and value drivers, we have extended the appendices, and I invite you to refer to them. Although EDF Renewables EBITDA decreased by 23% in organic terms, the key points here are resilience and growth. Resilience, because COVID impacts are non-material on EBITDA, as most of the revenues are secured by long-term contracts, and growth, because EBITDA from production increased by 4.7% in organic terms, benefiting from new installed capacities. Distributed solar and maintenance operation activities, mainly in the US, contributed positively to the EBITDA. Let me highlight that renewables reached a record level of projects with 8 gigawatts of gross capacity under construction at the end of 2020. It breaks down into 2.5 gigawatts of onshore wind, 1.6 gigawatts of offshore wind, and 3.9 gigawatts of solar. This confirms our strong ambition, which is doubling of net capacity between 2020 and 2024, backed by an extended pipeline and strong expertises and developed also in the appendices. Let's now move to services. Dalkia's EBITDA decreased by 17.5% in organic terms to 290 million euros. Adjusted from the COVID effect, the decrease would have been limited to 6%. The group EBITDA in these services business reached 318 million euros. The COVID impact consisted of reduction in sales volumes of energy and services due to the closure of many customer sites and the postponement of construction works. Increased competitiveness, in line with the operational performance plan, Controlled overheads and new or renewed commercial contracts had a favorable effect on the EBITDA. Conversely, occasional difficulties with UK contracts penalized financial performance. As regards Framatome, EBITDA was up by 0.8% in organic terms to 534 million euros, despite the effects of the health crisis, including the margin realized with EDF group entities. Framatome's contribution to the group's EBITDA amounted to 271 million euros, up 4.7% in organic terms compared to 2019. Adjusted from the COVID effect, the increase would have been of around 23%. The growth in EBITDA mainly reflects the good performance of the fuel business thanks to a better sales product mix. Fuel plants were running all year, even during the first lockdown. EBITDA also benefited from the continuation of the plan to reduce operating costs and overheads. One of the main achievements for Framatome in 2020 was also the signature of an agreement with Rolls-Royce with a view to acquire its civil nuclear instrumentation and control business, which would allow to strengthen its engineering expertise and global command control capabilities. Order intake amounted to 2.9 billion euros in 2020. EBITDA in the United Kingdom amounted to 823 million euros, up by 9.8% in organic terms. Adjusted from the COVID effect, the increase would have reached 33%. The health crisis had an overall negative impact on EBITDA of 182 million euros, mainly due to a drop in consumption of 12% of industrial and professional customers and increased collection risks and trade receivables. EBITDA was penalized by the decline in nuclear output in 2020, but benefited from the increase in nuclear realized prices. As for supply, residential customer margins improved despite a declining customer portfolio and in an environment that remains highly competitive. Let me highlight two additional points. First, PodPoint deployed around 35,000 charging points in the UK in 2020. This is clearly a great achievement, and in order for PodPoint to continue to develop its business model, EDF and its minority partner Legal & General are considering all the funding options to support PodPoint's strategy and allow it to be in the most favorable position to continue to fuel its growth. Second, EDF Energy took over last month the 360,000 customers from Green Network Energy. In Italy, EBITDA recorded an organic increase of 8.4% to 683 million euros. The resilience in front of the COVID epidemic was primarily linked to the strong upstream and downstream integration business in Italy. Adjusted from the COVID effect, the increase would have been of around 18%. The fall in demand from industrial clients and decrease in services due to the health crisis impacted EBITDA for Italy by an estimated 60 million euros. EBITDA for the electricity activities was up, thanks in particular to a stronger contribution from renewable production. EBITDA for gas activities was also up, benefiting from better optimization of medium and long-term gas supply contracts. Finally, supply activities benefited from improved margins on electricity sales to residential and industrial customers and growth in services to residential customers. The completed sale of most of the E&P activities, excluding Algeria and Norway, to Energian, and the forthcoming disposal of Edison's Norwegian E&P activities to Sval Energi enable a refocusing of the group's Italian strategic activities, also consistently with the priorities of Italy's national climate and energy plan. As regards the other international segment, EBITDA was up 20.9% organically to 380 million euros. Adjusted from the COVID effect, the increase would have been of around 29%. In Belgium, EBITDA was up by 18.9% in organic terms to 247 million euros. The health crisis had an unfavorable impact on EBITDA of circa 26 million euros due to a decline in consumption and service activities and to an increased collection risks of trade receivables. EBITDA growth was driven by better output of the nuclear fleet back to a normal level and more favorable pricing than in 2019. overall, 2020 benefited from a strong performance in wind farm generation, plus 26%, thanks to favorable wind conditions and new installed capacity. Net installed wind capacity increased to 548 megawatt, up 13.5% versus end 2019. Let me also mention that a few weeks ago, Luminus signed an agreement with E.ON to purchase its Belgium subsidiary, Essent Belgium, supplying electricity and gas to more than 330,000 customers. This would comfort the number 2 position of Luminus in Belgium. In Brazil, EBITDA was up 16.7% in organic terms to 115 million euros, mainly due to the revaluation in 2019 and 2020 of the power purchase agreement for the EDF Norte Fluminense power plant. The EBITDA of other activities declined by 44.8% organically to 261 million euros. The gas business was affected by provisions for onerous contracts in LNG activities, recorded mainly because of the downward revision of medium and long-term spreads between the US and Europe. EDF Trading's EBITDA amounted to 633 million euros, down 11.2% in organic terms, compared to an exceptional year in 2019. Trading activities remained strong, generating a solid 2020 result in a context of high volatility. Let's now move to the other items of the P&L. EBIT for the year was down by 2.9 billion euros to 3.9 billion euros. This development can first be explained by the decrease in EBITDA of 0.5 billion euros. Volatility of commodities had a year-on-year unfavorable impact of 0.8 billion euros. This element recorded the net changes in fair value on energy and commodity derivatives, excluding trading activities, on contracts which do not qualify as hedge accounting, primarily in relation to Edison's gas positions. The net depreciation and amortization raised by 0.8 billion euros. This can be explained by a volume effect related to newly commissioned equipment in the French nuclear fleet for 0.4 billion euros, a volume effect in other segments of the group, mainly in regulated activities and in the UK nuclear fleet, and to a lesser degree by the accelerated depreciation of the French coal-fired fleet from June 2019 for 0.1 billion euros. Impairments increased by 0.4 billion euros with an impact for the existing nuclear fleet in the UK for 0.6 billion euros. Other operating income and expenses increased by 0.3 billion euros, mainly for the preparation of repairs of secondary circuits wells in Flamanville 3 for 0.4 billion euros. The financial result for 2020 resulted in a financial expense of 2.6 billion euros, deterioration of 2.2 billion euros from 2019. This change can be explained mainly by, first, a decrease in the cost of gross financial debt of 0.2 billion euros due to debt repayments and issuances at more favorable rates. Second, a negative change of 0.6 billion euros in the discount effect, mainly due to a decrease in the discount rate used for nuclear provisions in France of 20 basis points in real terms in 2020, which compares to a 10 bips decrease in 2019. The impact is 0.6 billion euros. At the end of 2020, the real discount rate was 2.1%. A 1.8 billion euros decrease in other financial income and expenses, of which 1.3 billion euros due to the fair value adjustment of financial assets held in the dedicated assets portfolio. The financial assets portfolio performed well in 2020, despite the health crisis, with a strong recovery in the second half of the year. However, the performance was not as strong as in 2019. The overall performance of our portfolio of dedicated assets was of 5.9%, plus 5.9% in 2020 versus plus 13.5% in 2019. Net income group share came to 0.65 billion euros versus 5.2 billion euros in 2019. As detailed previously, the EBIT and financial result represented a combined decrease of 5.1 billion euros compared to 2019. Tax charge followed the evolution of EBITDA and financial result and included a provision following a tax reassessment on nuclear provisions. Adjusted from non-recurring items, The effective tax rate was similar in 2020 versus 2019. The group's share in net income of associates was a positive 0.4 billion euros in 2020, compared to 0.8 billion euros in 2019. This negative 0.4 billion euros variation can be explained mainly by the decrease in CNG's net income, which was driven by a positive fair value adjustment of financial assets in 2019. The group's net income, excluding non-recurring items, stood at 2 billion euros in 2020. Just a quick word, as usual, on the post-tax effects of non-recurring items. In 2020, they stood at a negative 1.3 billion euros versus a positive 1.3 billion euros in 2019. Impairment losses have been recorded on some specific assets for a total amount of 0.8 billion euros versus 0.9 billion euros in 2019. And the main element here was a 0.4 billion euros depreciation of the existing nuclear fleet in the United Kingdom. Net changes in fair value of financial instruments are accounted for in non-recurring income and represented 0.9 billion euros post-tax in 2020 versus 1.8 billion euros in 2019. Other elements, including commodities volatility, represented minus 1.3 billion euros post-tax in 2020 versus plus 0.4 billion euros in 2019. Looking now at the cash flow. Operating cash flow, excluding Linky and HPC, stood at 3.2 billion euros, down 0.9 billion euros from 2019. Group cash flow established at minus 2.7 billion euros. EBITDA adjusted for non-cash items amounted to 16.5 billion euros, up by 1.7 billion euros from 2019, mainly due to settlements of underlying positions on EDF Trading's financial instruments. Working capital deteriorated by 2.2 billion euros in 2020 compared to 2019. The difference is essentially explained by the increase in stocks of capacity certificates for 0.5 billion euros and the margin calls situation and external receivables and debt in the optimization and trading activity. The net investments, excluding disposals, HPC and Linky, increased slightly to 11.6 billion euros. Disposals with cash impact in 2020, meaning closed transactions and not only signed ones, generated 0.2 billion euros of proceeds in 2020 versus 0.5 billion euros in 2019. The cash flow excluding Linky and HPC amounted to circa minus 0.1 billion euros, close to zero, despite the COVID crisis. As you know, we are currently in a very particular period, as EDF is financing the construction of very large assets on its balance sheet for a very long period without getting cash against it. If I analyze a bit further 2020 cash flow, I notice that we have invested 0.7 billion euros in Linky, 1.9 billion euros for HPC, and almost 0.5 billion euros for Flamanville, 3 on top of 0.4 costs registered in P&L. Excluding these long-term yet non-cash generating projects, 2020 group cash flow is clearly positive. On top of that, studies and engineering costs concerning Sizewell C and EPR2 represented almost 0.3 billion euros. For these two projects, the group intends to get prepayments post-FEED during the construction period and does not intend to bear Sizewell C on its balance sheet. You can refer to the appendices for more details. As just detailed, the total of net investments amount to 14.1 billion euros, an increase by 0.1 billion euros compared to 2019. With two trends: the increase of more than 1 billion euros in renewables net investments linked to the proceeds in 2019 of the partial disposal of energy in the UK, and a reduction of investments at Flamanville 3 in relation to the new scheduling and knowing that abnormal costs linked with the weldings were accounted for in the P&L. Please let me remind you that 94% of the group's investments contribute to climate change mitigation actions. Let's now review the evolution of the net financial debt. This slide summarizes the evolution of the cash flow of minus 2.7 billion euros that we have just reviewed. It does also include the positive impact of the hybrid issuance for 2.1 billion euros. As a consequence, the net financial debt established at 42.3 billion euros at the end of 2020. To put in a nutshell my key messages, we have precisely analyzed the impact of the COVID and given you detailed analysis since June 2020. We have immediately reacted by setting and implementing an ambitious action plan based on cost-cutting and disposal of non-strategic assets in order to maintain our ability to finance our CAP 2030 strategy. And third point, excluding COVID impact, we have reached the goals previously set. To help you understand always better our company and value drivers, we have significantly enriched the appendices we provide you with. You'll find there, in particular this year, detailed strategic and ESG goals, updated and detailed slides about our renewables business, and new and detailed slides about Enedis. This ends my presentation, and let me now hand over to Jean-Bernard Lévy.
Begin the question and answer session. As a reminder, if you wish
Okay, just a few words. For year 2021, we have set an EBITDA target higher than 17 billion euros and the net financial debt to EBITDA ratio of less than 3 times. We also confirm our medium-term objectives, as already announced in July. We are aiming to reduce our operating expenses by 500 million euros, excluding inflation, by the end of 2022 when compared to the end of 2019. And we will dispose assets for approximately 3 billion euros over the period of 2020 to 2022. By the end of 2022, we are aiming for a net financial debt to EBITDA ratio of around 3 times. Target dividend payout will be in the range of 45 to 50%. The scrip dividend option will be available to all shareholders in 2021. The French government has committed to maintain this option. The achievement of these targets will obviously depend on the evolution of the sanitary restrictions. 2020 was a challenging year to the upheaval caused by the pandemic. 2021 looks like it will be just as intense. Most importantly, I hope it will create a fresh impetus for EDF. In spite of the current uncertainties, my ambitions for EDF remain unchanged. We have everything it takes to play a leading role in the energy transition, to be France's and Europe's champion of a low-carbon economy and the vector of sustainable growth for our country and for Europe. We have a clear and robust strategy which is well aligned with the main challenges of our society. We have a skilled and committed workforce. We have the undeniable ability to change and innovate. However, this ambition will not become reality without massive investment in new generation facilities, in networks, in new customer services, in technology and in innovation. We need structural reforms that will provide us with the means to fulfill our ambitions. First of all, I think that the reform of the ARENH system, the ARENH is a mechanism that in its present form makes EDF's strategic and financial equation inextricable and which puts EDF on a downward slope. I will say it again, in its present form, the ARENH mechanism is an unjustifiable poison which inevitably puts EDF in greater debt. We are asking for a stable and fair regulation that will adequately remunerate us for the nuclear power we generate while guaranteeing competitive electricity prices for French consumers to enjoy. We have to accept that if only the ARENH reform meets our requirements, we will have to reorganize our activities while ensuring that the integrated EDF group has the means to develop in all sectors of the energy transition. Simultaneously, we need to protect the nation's hydro assets and to avoid reducing their value in terms of energy, farming, environment, irrigation and tourism. A solution is emerging which could help to achieve this goal. I'm convinced that we can resolve the EDF equation by keeping an integrated group. For several decades, this integrated characteristic has been one of the keys to the economic, environmental, human and industrial success of France's energy model. It needs to be sustained. The French state shares these views and continues to support EDF like it has always done. I hope that a solution will emerge very soon because time is passing. For 2021 and 2022, we have what we need to stay the course while waiting for the indispensable reform to be implemented. Thank you for your attention. And now Xavier and I, we will take questions that you may have over our internet networks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin the question and answer session. As a reminder, if you wish to ask a question, please press *1 on your telephone and wait for your name to be announced. If you wish to cancel your request, please press the # key. Once again, please press *1 if you wish to ask a question. And your first question comes from the line of Vincent Ayral, calling from JP Morgan. Please ask your question.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for the presentation. Indeed, recognizing the clear effort to provide clarity on the COVID impact through the year, so thank you for that. A couple of questions. First, obviously, we have to go through Hercule, the final point which was made. Indeed, time is running. From a practical point of view, what would be technically the type of ultimate deadline to get an agreement if Hercule were to be implemented before the elections? I think that's a key question for us to understand. There are technicalities to get the bill through Parliament and everything. It's just for us to be able to understand basically how much time is left for an agreement to be reached before for implementation before the election. Similarly, on Hercule, if you could give a bit of color on the quasi-régie type of status. And the second question is regarding the EBITDA guidance. If it's possible to provide us with a bit of a bridge to get to the 21 guidance. I noticed that the French nuclear target was not upgraded. The 2020 target was put at a very, very conservative level and went up materially through the year. So could we expect a bit of upside there? And the second thing there is below EBITDA, obviously there's been a change in law on the nuclear discount ceiling rate. What are you expecting in terms of to apply, basically in terms of a nuclear discount rate in 2021 and for the years after? In effect, you have the ability here to potentially increase your earnings by 25 cents, 40 to 50%, and to avoid segregating 5 billion of cash in the dedicated assets. So this matters, especially if Hercule does not happen. Thank you.
Very much. I will take the first series of questions, and Xavier will take the second series of questions. Regarding your first question, obviously the negotiations are in the hands of the European Commission and the hands of the French government, and we are not part of the negotiations. It's a matter of a regulation, and so no company should be part of these negotiations. Quite clearly, we are supporting, we are assisting, we are giving information to the French government and trying to understand where this could lead to. It is obvious that there is a political agenda in France and that many people will object to the ability of a reform, if a reform is agreed, if an acceptable reform is agreed. What is the likelihood of such a reform be implemented before elections in 2022? And I am not the one in charge of the agenda on the French Parliament. This is also obviously in the hands of both the government and the Parliament. And to me, what is important is that, as I have said, and I'm happy to repeat, we have secured 2021 and 2022 in such a way that we can implement our CAP 2030 strategy in 21 and in 22 in the current circumstances. Of course, except if there is another major sanitary crisis. But let's take that away. Let's put it on the side. In the current sanitary situation, we have 21 and 22 in front of us in order to follow up with our CAP 2030 strategy. And indeed, we have slightly enhanced some of the 2030 or 2023 targets that we had set earlier on, and we did discuss that in the presentation. So that's where we are today. We have secured 21 and 22, and we are hoping for a green light towards an acceptable solution from the negotiators as soon as possible. On the quasi-régie, which I don't know how to say in English, there is a 2016 directive from the EU that under certain conditions allow for a business, an activity to be managed as if, quasi is a bit like as if, quasi in English, as if it was a state business, but it is not a state business, but it has to follow certain guidelines. It has to follow certain guidelines that show that it is almost like a state business. It is almost like a business directly managed by the state. So there have been discussions on putting our hydro system, the EDF part of the hydro French system, under the quasi-régie agreement. And we believe that from these discussions that it looks doable, that under certain conditions, and maybe some of them still have to be detailed, that the EDF hydro system, what we call EDF hydro, could maybe be managed within the integrated group EDF as a quasi-régie, and that would be an exception to the competition on hydro concessions that is supposed to be implemented due to a directive that dates back 20 years ago. So what we would implement is an application of a recent directive about 5 years ago that would enable to resolve this long-lasting situation where EU directive would directly create an immense loss of value for the community of users, for consumers, for companies, an immense loss of value both in France and in the EU due to the very negative effects of the dismantling of several sets of dams that go through valleys and which can only be optimized with a single operator. So this is something we are supporting, and it looks like the discussions between the French state and Brussels are coming to some kind of an agreement in principle. Although we are not aware that this part of discussion is closed. We are just aware that this is making progress. Xavier, for the EBITDA guidance in 21 and the discount rates on our liabilities.
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Bernard. So, as regards the EBITDA guidance, maybe some major bricks to take into consideration. First, the French nuclear output that we expect, as we've said, between 330 and 360 terawatt-hours. So, let's say an additional terawatt-hours, roughly speaking, if you consider the middle of this range. So this could bring an additional 0.5 billion euros. Then another significant break linked to the regulated business with the indexations on the tariffs and the rollout of Linky for maybe an additional break around 0.6 billion euros. Third block, obviously, is linked to the more back to normal situation regarding the downstream and service businesses, which could be estimated at circa 0.4 billion euros. And finally, the special tax relief allowed by the French government stimulus package, which is estimated to bring an additional 0.3 billion euros EBITDA. On the downside, power prices, both in France and in the UK, and combined with possibly lower capacity price in France, would have an unfavorable impact of circa 0.8 billion euros in 21 compared to 20. So as a sum of all these bricks, you find an additional 1 billion EBITDA, very consistent with our guidance, higher than 17 billion euro. And of course, as highlighted in the communication, of course, this is subject to additional reinforced sanitary restriction impacts. As regards the discount rate, I will not give you our prospect, but I could highlight the fact that we have adjusted the methodology of calculation of this discount rate, taking into consideration the new regulation of the ceiling of the discount rate. So from now on, from 2020 on, this discount rate is calculated on the basis of the ultimate forward rate, the curve of the ultimate forward rate. This gave 2.1% net in 2020, and we show here also that the regulatory ceiling reached 2.7%, in fact 2.66% in 2020. So this is how now the discount rate will be calculated for the years to come.
Thank you. I guess we probably have more questions coming.
Thank you. Your next question comes from the line of Emmanuel Turpin, calling from Societe Generale. Please ask your question.
Good morning, everybody. I will start with the first question on full year 21. Thank you very much, Javier, for the blocks on EBITDA. I guess I'd love a little bit more detail on the negative block of power prices. You mentioned France and UK, and you mentioned assumptions on capacity payments. So I guess part of this 0.8 is very visible on your forward hedges, on parties assumptions based on some other market development. I'd love to have some views maybe between France and UK for this 0.8. Still on guidance, you do not provide guidance for ordinary net earnings. We've got a consensus expectation at around 2.3 billion, which is on the basis of what you reported for net earnings 2020 at almost 2 billion. On your guidance for EBITDA looks easily achievable. Do you feel comfortable with that consensus expectation? And then turning to, of course, the pillars of the investment case, which is Hercule and re-regulation. I totally understand that as management of EDF, you cannot provide probabilities or even views about the conclusion of the discussions. But on the technical points, for these hydro concessions, you believe they are achievable to be put in a quasi-régie. Is there anything in the EU directive that would change the pricing regime for these hydro business? As we read some press articles saying that there may be some regulated price for hydro under a quasi-régie. Could they still function in a merchant framework? And indeed, is this what you have in mind? And secondly, we had numerous speeches from government representatives in front of Parliament recently, insisting that a reform was absolutely necessary. So echoing your view, at the same time, they said that the positive conclusion was not ensured, and if there was no positive conclusion, there would need to be a plan B. Today, has the government asked the management of EDF or the board of EDF to start working on a plan B, or are you still just full steam ahead on plan A? Thank you very much.
I start? Thank you, Emmanuel. So as regards the price, some elements. First, as regards France, and you'll see that also in the appendices, the price that has been identified for 2020 is 46 euro per megawatt hour average hedged price, and 45 for 21. And as regards the UK, we see also a downward trend as regards our hedge price in 21 compared to 2020. Third point in this price trend between 20 and 21, the capacity, and in particular there were two auctions in 2020, which is the first time, and you will not have this effect for 21. And as regards the price of the capacity, we'll see there are 6 remaining auctions in 21 for 22 that will take place in 21. As regards the consensus, you have certainly noticed that we are really in 2020 very well in line with the consensus. And as regards 21 consensus, yes, I feel comfortable with this consensus.
On the second part of your question, Emmanuel, I would say question 2.1. Yes, indeed, we are working on the assumption that once it is in the quasi-régie, the output generation coming from our hydro dam will remain in the world of merchant pricing and will not enter the world of regulated pricing. And secondly, we are working hard in order to try and support the negotiations on what one could call Plan A, and this is on the top of our mind right now, working very hard on what is quite a complex set of negotiations, and I think the government is supporting that we put our best efforts in trying to support these tough negotiations and get something done as soon as possible. Thank you.
Your next question comes from the line of Olivier van Dolselaar calling from Exane. Please ask your question.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you also on my side for taking this question. I have three. The first one would actually be coming back to Hercule again in the discussions with the European Commission. I wonder if you could help us understand a little bit where you actually see the grey zone in terms of getting a possible agreement on the structure, because from the outside it looks like, as you mentioned, you would like an integrated EDF structure, and Mr. Levy, I think you mentioned in the Senate that you would like EDF Green to sit underneath EDF Blue, whilst it actually looks like the European Commission would like a separation between the two. So it could seem unconciliable, if you want, unless there is a grey zone where actually there is the way to get some form of integrated structure, whilst there would be some form also of separation between the two. I wonder if you could help us understand a bit where that grey zone might be. And then second question, just on the working capital, which was quite negative in 2020. I was wondering if you would expect some of that to reverse. And then the third question is on what is actually happening in Edison. So we are indeed seeing quite a move in terms of the structure of the Edison portfolio. You have actually put some of your own renewable assets in Italy back into Edison. I was wondering, could that be the preparation of something that might change in terms of your approach to how Edison fits in the group, or should we not look too much into what's happening over there? Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier. I will take your first and third question, and I will let working capital matters in the hands of Xavier, who's got all the expertise and more. On the first point, as I have said, we are trying to find an agreement, and from what I know of the negotiations between the European Union and the French government, we believe that, as we said, for instance, on the quasi-régie, some progress has been made. However, we believe from what we hear today that there are still some very important pending issues that, if not properly resolved, would mean that there is no acceptable solution. So these are matters of great importance in the ability to reach an agreement that I will now very quickly list. The first one is the price of the generation that we would sell. As you know, it was thought at one point in time that maybe there would be a corridor, there would be a floor, there would be a cap, and the price would go between the floor and the cap according to market rules. And indeed, the French government organized a consultation on this principle back in 2020. It looks like the price will now be a set price, a fixed price, a single price that will be indexed, sort of CPI-based indexation. But right now, the matter regarding the price, as far as EDF is aware, is pending and is, of course, of utmost importance. Also of utmost importance is the legal robustness of the mechanism that would be implemented. I don't need to expand on this. And also is of utmost importance is how we can continue to manage EDF as an integrated group. And I think there is there also a very clear understanding that in no way would the potential reform be any first step into splitting EDF or privatizing any key asset or anything that would mean that EDF as very solid and well-balanced entity managing both generation, networks, decentralized energy and assets, and of course selling to a variety of clients, that there is no way that this would be taken apart. So I think when you look at this, you understand that there are still some key things to be discussed before we have to sort of, look at what's been achieved and say, okay, do we go for it? Is it acceptable? This is not the time right now for us to make such a judgment, to me personally, to make such a judgment, because the discussions are still open on many of these matters. Your third question is regarding Edison. I'm quite happy to say that over the years, I think we are transforming Edison into a company which is more and more core to EDF's activities. We have been selling non-essential assets. So to give a few examples, we were having something which is not our business, which is an oil and gas exploration and operations of oil and gas assets, and this is not part of what EDF wants to do. And by the way, even more so with our raison d'être. So we've been selling these assets, and we have also sold some non-essential assets, like, for instance, some gas distribution networks, some gas pipes that that were a legacy asset from the old Edison a long time ago. And on the other hand, we've been acquisitive in Edison. We have been acquisitive in terms of renewables generation. We've been acquisitive in terms of efficiency services for various categories of clients. We are building more decarbonized energy assets. We have been acquiring portfolio of clients like the former Gaz Natural clients that we acquired maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So Edison today looks much more like EDF in France or in the UK in terms of its portfolio of assets, and we believe that Edison is absolutely core to the growth of our CAP 2030 strategy. And I'm quite happy that the Edison performance, which has been also released in details this morning, is really excellent, and I want to commend my Italian colleagues from reaching such good numbers.
As regards the working capital, there are 3 main elements to analyze the delta in the working capital requirement in 2020. First, trading activity with margin calls for 0.6 billion euros. Second, increase in the stock of capacity certificates for 0.5 and energy saving certificates for 0.2, so as a whole 0.7 billion euros. And third, 0.5 billion euros linked to the CSPE, compensation for public energy service charges. As the generation of renewables has increased more than anticipated in 2020, and spot prices have decreased considerably during the sanitary crisis, hence increasing the amount to be temporarily supported by EDF. Do we have one question on the net? No question on the net. Last one on the phone.
Is that it? No more questions?
More questions on the phone. Your next question comes from the line of Peter Bistiger calling from Bank of America. Please ask your question.
Yeah, good morning. So I was wondering, first of all, if you could clarify whether and indeed how you would expect to deliver the investment required for your more ambitious 2030 targets, particularly the 60 gigawatt renewables target, if the talks over reform of your nuclear tariff are not successful. And then my second question was just to clarify something about your EBITDA guidance. So would you still expect to achieve the 17 billion EBITDA if nuclear output ended up at the bottom end of your 330 to 360 terawatt hour range? And then a final question just on bad debt. So I was just wondering if you're seeing any worsening in the retail bad debt situation in the UK over the last 2 or 3 months. Thank you.
First question, and maybe Xavier will take the third question, and we will both sing the same song regarding the second question, which is that yes, indeed, we are confirming 17 billion as a minimum in our EBITDA 2021 in case we are on the low part of the 330 to 360 terawatt hour range for nuclear generation in 2021. Regarding your first question, it's I think quite clear. If we are as we are, we believe we can reach 60 gigawatts. If we manage to get our new organization with a split between the P&L that is dedicated to nuclear and thermal and another P&L dedicated to decentralized low carbon electricity. We believe that this decentralized low carbon electricity part of the integrated EDF group will have more ability to raise money, for instance, from the stock market, or to have its own P&L in order to accelerate in the generation of renewables. And we believe that there are so many opportunities all around the world, including in France, that we could quite easily continue to be acquiring more capacity, winning competitive situations, and not selling as many of what we build as we have sold in the previous years. And that would mean that in that part of the future EDF group, of the integrated group, what is today a 60 gigawatt target would become a 100 gigawatt target. So we would grow it by close to 70% due to the change in the speed of renewables implementation that would be allowed by the reform.
As regards the bad debt, of course, as a consequence of the COVID crisis, the risk of unpaid bills increased in 2020. As we already communicated in H1, we've set specific operational plans to monitor the level of this bad debt. It's under control. It's included in our 2020 numbers. The level of bad debt increased by around 160 million euros in 2020 at group level compared to 2019. With the COVID impact, which is in the range of 80 million euros for France, 67 for the UK, 9 for Italy, and 13 for Luminous.
Thank you, Xavier. Maybe time for one or two, maybe more questions. Let's take the next one.
Your next question comes from the line of Sam Ari calling from UBS. Please ask your question.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's been a really helpful presentation this morning, and all your comments in particular on the process with Europe are, much appreciated. I think I just wanted to add two sort of broad follow-ups to that whole discussion. And the first is if an agreement on the new regulation comes, and the second is, if it doesn't. So firstly, if we do get a final agreement, and you do the restructuring and maybe the quasi-regie for the hydro, as you discussed, then does that basically secure the future of EDF in your view? Or are the other steps still necessary? For example, you just talked about maybe accessing the stock market for the EDF Green subsidiary. I'm interested if that sort of feels to you that it's necessary, or whether that would be a sort of optional additional step. And relatedly, the press talked in the past about delisting the EDF parent group and squeezing out the minorities. I just wonder if that is in any way necessary for the future of EDF. So that's my first question, if you get the agreement. And secondly, if for any reason the agreement doesn't get over the line before the election, and perhaps an outcome is delayed a year or two, then can I just ask what your thoughts are about the fallback? You said you're okay for 2021 and 2022, but what would be the approach beyond that? Would you have to, scale back the capex plan somehow, and how easy can you do that? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You're getting me into a lot of scenarios. What I can say is that we are working on the scenario which has been described at length, whereby the future EDF has the quasi-régie, which means that some of its activities, which are today partly owned by non-state investors, non-state shareholders, become fully owned by the state, and that would include both the nuclear and thermal businesses and the quasi-régie by itself. On the other hand, the decentralized low-carbon electricity assets would be listed with the mother company keeping, and probably through some very strong legislative restrictions, keeping a very strong majority position in this low-carbon decentralized electricity asset, which we call VER. Okay, this is what we are working on. We are not today working on any situation where all the current EDF activities, which you guys are representing, the non-French state shareholding of all of them, would move into French state full ownership. We are not working on that. On the second part of your question, which is the 23, 24, and so on outlook, one can have many various scenarios regarding what happens if in a few weeks or months we consider that we have to postpone what has been discussed. There are nobody is, I think, able to forecast what will be the outcome of the political elections in France in 2022. So we have to be prepared for an energy policy, an EDF strategy policy from the French shareholder to be reviewed at that point in time. And we, of course, will be working on such scenarios as time comes. Right now, we are happy to say that with the current situation, with the plans that we implemented very soon after the beginning of the pandemic, and which we released in July last year, we are happy to say that we are sort of secured, safe by the end into the end of 2022, and that will give us time to prepare for what we will be able to design together with the French government in due time. Maybe one more question, one last question before we roll up.
Thank you. So your final question comes from the line of Arthur Sidney, calling from Morgan Stanley. Please ask your question.
Yes, thank you for taking my question, Arthur Sidney here. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on the recent developments of competition in the renewables industry. We've seen an increase in competition, especially in offshore wind, in recent offshore wind auctions. If you have any thought on that would be helpful. Thank you very much.
It's a good question. Indeed, we have seen recently a very competitive situation for quite an extensive set of opportunities, which was presented by the Crown Estate in the United Kingdom for some offshore wind property or potential property that has been awarded, and EDF has not been successful. We have looked at it with our usual very strict financial constraints. We have bid in order to be able to generate value. We have value creation targets, which we are not playing with. We have a very strong discipline in that matter. And very often we are able to reconcile our value creation objectives with a tender, competitive situation. And as such, we have recently been awarded some new offshore developments in several countries, and this offshore business, which is growing very fast, we are one of the major players. Now, the organization, the way that the tender was organized by the Crown Estate was very complex and was very long-term. You are allowed to, if you win, you're allowed to prepare for a bid which you will place maybe by 2026, 2027, maybe. And you have permitting questions, you have pricing uncertainties, even you're not even sure you will get anything. But in the meantime, you have to pay a lot of money to the owner, which is the Crown Estate, for you to be allowed at one point in time to bid into a tender in several years. So a lot of complexity, and to us, not a success, but we are very proud that we know that we can walk away, even if the fruit ahead of you, even if it is 10 years ahead of you, the fruit looks very attractive. But if the road to get there is expensive and risky, we are proud that we have the ability to walk away, and this is what we did. That's it, I guess, my friends, for this conference, for this investor meeting. Thank you, all of you, for attending, for your very precise questions, for following EDF so closely. I wish all of you a good day and, more importantly, a good health. Thank you.